All right, so first I'm going to talk about the New Haven Climate Movement. So the New Haven Climate Movement, or NHCM, is a climate activist group based in New Haven where high school and college students are able to come together and work towards these climate change issues. And there are four main initiatives. The first one is the Climate Education Committee, which essentially promotes climate education in New Haven schools and encourages these schools to proactively cut greenhouse gas emissions. The second main initiative is the Electric Future campaign, which is pushing for New Haven to be 100% electrified and just generally educating the public about the benefits of this electrification. The third one I'm talking about is the New Haven Rescue Plan, which is a campaign for the city to put $9 million from the $90 million relief fund that they're getting and putting that set amount towards the climate change, towards climate prevention. And then the last initiative that I'll be talking about is the Connecticut Green New Deal, which is essentially putting some pressure on the Connecticut House, the Connecticut Senate, and the Governor Lamont to pass a Green New Deal, which is essentially a proposal where we'd invest in green jobs and energy. All right, so that was a bit of a lot. So just essentially in a nutshell, it's the main three goals are just to educate people about climate change, promoting this education across the community, promoting our cause and gaining more volunteers that are willing to help out, and then also campaigning for funding that can help be put towards climate mitigation efforts.
So we are all part of CHEP, or the Climate Health Education Project, and we work to advance youth-led climate education in New Haven area. CHEP is comprised of 10 student interns working closely with teachers and administrators at 5 New Haven schools. These schools are Eastham's, Career, Common Ground, Hopkins, and Amistad. So far this year, CHEP interns have organized school-wide presentations on topics like fast fashion and have filled school halls with a myriad of climate education posters. The CHEP website serves as an online resource for educators hoping to implement climate education in their curriculums, providing activities in science, language arts, social studies, art, and Spanish. We also work in the New Haven area by organizing public actions and webinars, and we post original graphics and videos onto our social media accounts. This year, CHEP interns have organized 3 public actions to demand the allocation of federal funds to climate solutions and have grown our social media accounts to reach more people.
Okay, now after that brief introduction, we can finally go into the meat of this presentation, which will be talking about environmental justice, climate justice, and how these all intersect with racial justice. So as a definition for environmental justice kind of focuses more on environmental racism, that being systemic racism through the disproportionate effects Black, Indigenous, people of color face in their communities. For example, Black communities are more likely to be next to polluting factories and a lot of detrimental, harmful chemicals, and just very exposure to so many bad things. For example, let's see if I can remember, sorry, but not just from air pollution, but also just waste in general, landfills, that's also a really big problem. And so what environmental justice is calling for is to show how minority communities are just affected again by environmental racism. Climate justice, on the other hand, it works in the same way as it's trying to recognize how climate change affects BIPOC communities, of course, because climate change will exacerbate the conditions that we live in today and the inequities we see in society, but also how we're trying to combat climate change, which would be switching to electric energy, going carbon neutral or carbon zero, trying to lower our carbon footprint, and just ways in general to just lower our emissions, cut greenhouse gases, and stop polluting, stop sending greenhouse gas emissions and all this other stuff into the atmosphere into the atmosphere. And yeah, I'm sorry, but
Sorry. And in this video, we're going to just be watching, it's a brief history of environmental justice. It's a really interesting video, so I think you guys will definitely enjoy.
Nationally, the facilities where we dump our garbage and process dangerous chemicals tend to be located in poor and minority communities. The people who live there have little or no protection from the industries around them, and things could get worse. So there's this idea of environmental justice. It's pretty simple. Communities shouldn't be forced to deal with more pollution because they belong to a certain race, national origin, or income bracket. Yet America has struggled over the years to implement any serious policy that actually protects these communities. So let's lay out the ways the government has failed them.
We will not allow one county to become a dump site.
The fight for environmental justice took off in 1982, when residents of Warren County, North Carolina mounted mass demonstrations against a plan to dump contaminated soil in a landfill in their community. The EPA investigated 4 similar landfills in southern states and found that they were all located in Black or low-income neighborhoods. In 1987, the United Church of Christ Racial Justice Commission found that around the country, hazardous waste facilities were more likely to be located in mostly minority communities. Amid mounting proof, the federal government was forced to act.
I, George Herbert Walker Bush.
So in 1992, President George H.W. Bush founded the Office of Environmental Justice inside the EPA. 2 years later, President Bill Clinton signed an executive order requiring federal agencies to consider environmental justice in all of their policies, as well as extending civil rights protection to environmental discrimination. But Congress never passed a bill to make Clinton's executive order law. Then came George W. Bush. His administration shifted the focus of the Office of Environmental Justice from protecting low-income and minority communities to all people, leaving vulnerable populations without a federal environmental advocate.
80% of New Orleans, including much of downtown, is underwater.
Under Bush, many environmental civil rights claims were rejected or delayed for years. In 2009, after President Barack Obama's election, his administration recommitted to environmental justice.
Generally speaking, in this country, a lot of environmentally problematic facilities tend to be located in places where poor folks live.
Yet, during the 2 years Democrats controlled the House, the Senate, and the White House, they didn't file a single bill focused on strengthening environmental justice protections. Passing major environmental legislation faded further when Republicans took control of Congress in the 2010 midterm elections. Now, President Donald J. Trump is making good on his vow to weaken the EPA.
Environmental protection, what they do is a disgrace. Every week they come out with new regulations. They're making it impossible.
Who's going to protect the environment?
We'll be fine with the environment. We can leave a little bit.
This budget, a 31% cut to the EPA, $2.6 billion cut away from the EPA. That's what the president wants.
As the EPA loses funding and regulations are rolled back, vulnerable communities may very likely fall through the cracks. I'm Talia Buford. I'll be covering these communities and digging into
We hope you enjoyed that video and that you learned a lot about environmental justice. But even after that, there are some kind of divisions between climate activists and environmental justice activists. And so I just want to clarify and say that it is not a competition, especially for us advocacy group workers and people that are doing advocacy work, that we are not supposed to be fighting, especially when we are working towards a collective goal. For example, both movements are accomplishing the same thing. We each want the environment to be healthy, for us not to be like destroying the environment, to destroy the planet, to literally just have a future and so that we don't die. I think that's something we can all agree on. And so it's just very frustrating to see that there is a lot of division amongst advocacy group organizers just because of the different ways we address the same problems. So, there's a lot of things we create social distinctions as to what we label ourselves as, or, oh, we're environmental justice advocates, oh, we're climate advocates. These issues intersect, these issues are interwoven. And at the end of the day, it does no good to argue, especially when, again, we're all going to die at the end of the day if we don't solve this problem. And as BIPOC people, we are the ones that will be most affected by this. It doesn't make sense to squabble around saying, this is how we should do this, or this is how we should do that, or whatever, because in the end, advocacy work is messy. It's very messy. It's very hard. It's very hard to get political political power and to actually show our representatives, to show our local governments that this is a serious issue, this is something we should be working on, this is whatever. And it doesn't make sense to divide us or divide ourselves over labels, over really anything, when we're just trying to keep the earth safe and to keep ourselves safe, happy, breathing, you know, because at the end of the day, right, you can't have climate justice without environmental justice. And you can't have environmental justice without climate justice. And both of these issues involve racism and environmental racism. And we need to understand and empower the voices of BIPOC people, because again, we are the ones most affected. And a lot of the people at the forefront of these movements are white, which is okay, we're getting somewhere, but it's not enough, especially when there are so many things that we haven't discussed, haven't talked about, haven't said. And that's why we created this webinar, to like spread that information and to acknowledge the differences and how we are affected by climate change and environmental racism. And if you don't believe me, this guy will tell you all about it.
More. These natural disasters, including tornadoes and wildfires, they're all made worse by the climate crisis, and they've got something in common. The death and destruction disproportionately cripple poor communities, many of them also Black and minority communities. Climate change is typically discussed as a strictly environmental problem, sometimes as a health problem, recently as an anxiety-inducing problem amongst young people, and by people like me as an economic problem as well. But the climate crisis is also a problem of inequality and justice. Dozens of studies demonstrate that climate-aggravated natural disasters and pollution hurt poor and often Black communities in ways that barely touch wealthy white communities. This is as true of rural America as of American cities, many of which are still de facto segregated, with minority communities living in less desirable areas that are, in many cases, at lower elevations or more flood-prone, like we saw in Hurricane Katrina. Back in 2005, more than half of those who died in Katrina were Black, about 500 people. Many Black and brown Americans, by virtue of their relatively low income and accumulated wealth, live downwind from smoky plants or downriver from toxic emissions. According to a 2017 report by the NAACP and the Clean Air Task Force, Black people are 75% more likely to live in areas situated near facilities that produce hazardous waste. And according to a 2018 EPA survey, Black Americans are exposed to 1.5 times as much sooty pollution from fossil fuels as the population at large, which could mean that living near a coal-powered electrical plant, or could mean that they live too close to a highway. Regardless, science has proved that breathing in those types of toxins can cause lung disease, asthma, heart disease, and premature death. So if you consider yourself an environmentalist, it might feel disconcerting to hear the words racism and climate change in the same sentence, but to the Black and minority communities that are destroyed or held back by the climate crisis, the idea that it, like so much else in society, negatively affects poor and low-wealth people and disproportionately people of color rings very true.
Yeah, so we have panelists here who definitely have a lot of experience with the topics of environmental racism, environmental justice, and climate justice. We have 2 panelists here today. Originally, we were going to have 3. However, Doreen had something last minute and could not make it. But we have our 2 wonderful panelists. And Faye Taylor, if you would like to start us off by introducing yourself.
My God. Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Faith Taylor. My pronouns are she, her, and I am 24. I'm a first-year PhD student at Yale University, and the scholarly work that I've been doing focuses on environmental justice, which was what I studied, like environmental justice broadly in my master's program, and then environmental justice and the connections to the carceral state is what I am focusing on now as my dissertation.
All right, so I have a few questions that I'd like to ask Faith. So the first one that I'd like to ask is, to what extent does climate and environmental education play a role in your activism, and how can we utilize climate education to create more inclusive dialogue?
Okay, so the reason why, at least for me, I felt like the educational route was incredibly important, and I've spent most of my EJ career in academia, and I think that there's pluses and minuses associated with being in academia and like how that impacts like my own understanding of the topic and the power dynamics associated with being seen in that lens of like researcher versus community member. But I think it's really important for me because I didn't know about environmental justice until I was like halfway through my undergraduate career. So shout out to you all for times have changed, right? And I only graduated from college in 2018. So yeah, and I considered myself at the time to be an environmentalist broadly. And I didn't even know that these concerns existed until I was taking an environmental ethics class. And then I first came across the term environmental justice, and then I was like, okay, this is kind of complex. I need to look into this a little bit more, a little further. And then and as I started like getting into it, I'm like, all right, this is incredibly complex, and to spend even more time looking into this. So for me, I think it's hard to be active about a topic that you didn't know exist, right? So like I spent all this time beforehand being a environmentalist and just promoting overall like mainstream environmentalist ideals because that's what I knew. And I had no idea that these things were going on. So then how I wasn't able to be mobilized in any way or fashion around these concepts because I didn't know that they existed. And I think that education does play a huge role in like how you understand something. And I think that when you go into, and that's why I've spent so much time like just trying to understand like what is environmental justice, like what is environment, how does our perceptions about environment change, like what will justice look like, what are different forms of justice that can be used in communities, and what has been done by community members, and how do we center community member voices, and what does this look like? Because I think a lot of the actions that people take come from a place of necessarily like goodwill, but like poorly informed. And that is dangerous and can often promote like white supremacy, if not purposefully, but as a result from these ideas that are just informed with our own understanding. So thinking about like, how do I do more good and less harm? And that comes from education, like of myself being in these spaces and like letting community members educate me, right? Like if you're a community member, you're the expert. So removing that feeling of like expertise and really just being able to like learn and also unlearn things that have been just the way that we've been traditionally taught to conceptualize some of these topics and themes. So for me, I think that the key to doing good, meaningful work comes from actually understanding what is the problem. And then once you have a good grounding in like what is the problem, you can see what the solutions might be, because some of that stuff isn't going to be apparent on surface level. It's like, well, if you do this, then how does that lead to this problem down the line? Like, what does this mean? If you decide to do this action, like who gets left behind? And then like thinking critically about like how all of your actions aren't neutral and have implications, and what does that look like, so that at least when you decide to do something, you can say that you've thought through it, versus like, this is the first thing that I'm thinking should be done. Let's just go with that and hope for the best. So I think that's why this education angle is crucial, in my view, for being an ally and an advocate for those experiencing climate injustice and environmental injustice.
All right, thank you so much for that great response.
Yeah, and then before we get into any more of the questions, and just to say to our audience, if you would like to ask any of the panelists a question, you can put them in the chat. But these were just some of the questions that we got through our Google form. And then Wawa, would you like to introduce yourself next?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Wawa Guptaro. I'm super excited to be here. I have been like gushing. I was texting my sister 5 seconds ago. I was like, oh my goodness, like I'm seeing all these other folks of color talking about environmental justice in high school. And I just wish that I had this community when I was y'all's age. So I'm so happy here and super inspired. So like I said, I'm Wawa. I'm a 23-year-old environmental justice advocate. I'm currently a Rhodes Scholar at the University of Oxford, completing a master's in environmental governance. And I would say that I resonate as a climate storyteller. I think that some of the things that I've heard y'all talk about today in regards to the climate narrative is the fact that the mainstream environmental movement hasn't always been a super inclusive one and hasn't always been one that everyone has necessarily found themselves in, which is essentially why the environmental justice movement emerged. In addition to Warren County, you know, a lot of community members were seeing that there were things that were being missed in the mainstream environmental movement, and the EJ movement came about as a corrective measure to essentially include equity and justice within the framework of environmental policies and environmental narratives thus forward. And right now we're kind of seeing similar dynamics in regards to the climate space. I think oftentimes people may not see themselves, their narratives, as being ones that are pertinent in climate conversations. So the way that I see myself doing the work that I do is attempting to restructure the climate narrative, really make sure that everyone sees themselves as having a stake in the conversation, which to me therefore contributes to you know, facilitating and building up a climate movement that's made in the image of all of us. Do that through my organization, Black Girl Environmentalist, my research that's essentially attempting to advocate for beauty justice to be included within multicultural environmental education within that framework, and also just as a content creator and public speaker that attempts to help people find their climate stories. So that's a bit about me.
Okay, and just going on that, what are your suggestions for uplifting BIPOC voices in local communities in regards to climate change and the environmental movement?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'd say I have two answers to that. The first thing is, it's interesting because I think this question and the way that it's framed, oftentimes, because I get this question quite a bit, of like, how do we uplift BIPOC folks? And in my experience, I feel like folks of color are already involved in environmental work and have been for a long time. And the reason why people are asking the question of how do we get BIPOC folks to be involved in environmentalism, and the reason why people may not necessarily see the work that we've already been doing out of survival for so long around the world, is based off of an environmental and climate narrative that doesn't include us. That's the problem. So I would say whenever I get that question from like, say like an environmental nonprofit or folks that are trying to like diversify their membership or just try to understand how to connect with new audiences, I say it always goes back to framing, right? How are you talking about environmental issues? What do you think of as environmental issues, right? Before I talked about how the environmental justice movement really emerged as a corrective movement, right? The movement was born out of survival and understanding that, you know, issues of race and class must be at the forefront of conversations that we have about environmentalism and now the climate crisis. And not doing so doesn't, you know, allow us to create solutions that are equitable and work for everyone. So the way that I think that people should be thinking about this question is, okay, so if the conventional way that I've been thinking about environmental work, for instance, being out in nature all the time or having conventional environmental occupations, if I'm not seeing BIPOC folk in those spaces, perhaps my understanding of the environment isn't as holistic as it needs to be, right? Because the environmental umbrella includes so much. And we begin to open our eyes on what that must include, we realize that a lot of the other movements that we think of, you know, we always see BIPOC involved in racial justice movements because, again, matter of survival. That is an environmental justice concern, right? So we are involved in those spaces. And when you listen to the words that people are talking about in social justice spaces of facilitating a just future, that's very much the same language that we talk about in climate spaces, about facilitating a just climate future. So I'd say like, that is a good frame to have, but also an exercise that I always think of that grounds me in my work and I think could help with this question is, when we close our eyes and we think about what are the things that we would ideate in a what are the features and contours of a just world that we want to build? I think of the fact that I don't see a carceral state in a just future. I don't see a future that doesn't include equitable access to healthy, culturally competent food. I don't see a future where people aren't able to live a life beyond survival. When you think of the answers that come up in your mind, and you recognize that a lot of those answers may not conventionally be those that people consider as environmental or climate oriented, but they have everything to do with what we're fighting for. So once we ground ourselves in what we're looking towards, it's much easier to build alongside folks that may not conventionally be in environmental or climate spaces, but are essentially working towards the same thing in other spaces.
All right, yeah, that was a great response. Thank you so much for that. Now we'd like to go back to Faith and ask another question. So what parts of the climate and environmental activism have you prioritized most? Do you focus on local issues like pollution and energy conservation, or have you also focused on worldwide issues like deforestation?
Yeah, I think this is a really great question, and this question hit me very early on in in terms of my EJ work and like how I decided to approach my EJ scholarship. And at first, when I was like, I just want to know so much about like what is environmental justice, and I wanted to approach it from like a global context. And then when I started doing that, I had a professor who was like, you need to narrow it down. And then I was like, all right, I'll do the entire United States. And then he was like, maybe just try Florida. And then once I started looking into like what was going on in Florida, I was living in Florida at the time, I was like, yeah, this is a really, again, really complex, and scale is a concern. And I'll say this too, like my work focuses on environmental injustices and how they manifest themselves in the United States. Even though this is a global concern, and when I actually first came across environmental injustice, it was a case of the United States perpetrating environmental injustices in Haiti. So it was in this global context and like a very imperialist context. But just for my own like manageability in terms of like what I'm able to do and like what I'm able to understand in the US context. And I think in this space also just narrowing down into, I think when we think about anything, at least for me, I think anything that we love, we should be critical of and really see like, what is it doing? And like, where are the gaps? And when you start to look at like the way people conceptualize environmental justice and what it is, and what the EJ movement has done and is doing, you see that there's still vulnerable populations that are not always brought up in like the forefront of the way people conceptualize and understand environmental injustice. And it's usually coming from this lens of, we understand EJ as a concern for communities of color, low-income communities. We're looking at public health, like reduced health outcomes, and how communities are situated in proximity to physical hazards. But environmental justice is incredibly complex. So seeing that narrative will still miss vulnerable populations like the unhoused, vulnerable populations like what happens to those who are immigrants, migrants into this area, refugees, what happens to people who are incarcerated, and how does that get brought into like this mainstream EJ narrative, which is where my work is situated at now, and understanding like how carceral spaces fundamentally will always perpetrate environmental injustices for those who are detained within them, and why an environmentally just world, an environmentally just world will not have prisons or detention centers, in any form of the carceral state as we know it today is not supported as an EJ initiative. And seeing all people, I also believe that all environmental justice advocates, climate justice advocates, should also be prison abolitionists fundamentally. When you look at how injustices are manifested and integral into that space cannot exist without environmental injustices. It's tethered to environmental injustices in vulnerable communities. And I'm trying to understand like those intersections, and even just seeing like how even within that space, like there's differences within like gender identities, and how does that manifest in the carceral space. how does the role of like ability and ableism manifest in this space and also increase vulnerability to experiencing environmental injustices? So I'm really interested in like that intersectional nature. And again, I put this in the chat, and I think when we start thinking about like how we approach environmental justice, the terminology that we use is very like recent. In like the term environmental justice was really popularized in like 1987. But people have been doing environmental justice work and looking at all of these intersections for forever. So a lot of that work, unfortunately, gets missed in like what is considered like environmental justice scholarship and like who's been doing EJ work, right? Like people talk about Robert Bullard, but what about W.E.B. Du Bois in his book, Philadelphia Negro? He's chronicling environmental injustices happening in Philadelphia at the time when he's writing it. But because of the way that we conceptualize EJ, like we miss a lot of the work that's been done by people and also their activism and just how people can get, I guess, like pigeonholed into discipline or pigeonholed into like, oh, you're doing housing justice, like that's not environmental justice, like you're doing this, it doesn't count. So we're missing a ton of activism, and environmental justice frameworks are just so powerful in the way they can be used to approach questions. So I think I'm more in that lens of seeing like what are we missing, like whose work is being left behind, whose activism is being left behind, and whose concerns aren't being addressed in that forefront conversation. And what does that mean for them? Like, what does it mean to not be able to stake a claim into experiencing environmental injustice? Whose binary are we using to in a sense gatekeep what is environmental injustice, and who has claims to experiencing environmental injustice, and then who's also being denied aid from experiencing those injustices in the way that we conceptualize it? So I think that is the approach that I've decided to take, which is very like US centered right now, also like very US centered, very like focused incredibly like narrowly on the carceral state for now. But there's so many other intersections that I would like to explore. And yeah, it's just making things feasible for my own work for now, to do meaningful work without, like I said, like I think when you go into situations and try and even be an ally, but you're uninformed, it can be dangerous. So to be an ally and advocate, not at the expense of other people. And self-education is really important to that. Like it can be very labor intensive to have to constantly re-traumatize yourself, explain your experience to other people. When you just want to be like, all right, there's so many people who have written about this, like, why aren't you looking into that first, to not exert your own privileged power onto someone else to educate you. So that's how I am approaching it for now. We'll see how things manifest further down the line. I just got here, so I don't know. I don't know everything yet. It's only my second semester, but for now.
Yeah, I think that issue of like taking like either a global or like local scope has definitely like impacted the way I see the climate movement, especially as a child. The only like, climate education I was really exposed to was just like about like the penguins in like Antarctica, like really far away from me. Like, I'm like in New Haven and they're like, I don't know, North Pole, South Pole, I don't remember which one, but it's like, you don't really see the issue as really affecting you. I think like just among like people, I think we have kind of like a tendency to like not care about issues going on in like other countries, like on other groups. And when I started getting involved in like climate activism, I started reading up on like statistics about like how the rates of asthma in New Haven are much higher than in like other cities and just like urban cities in general. Highways cut through these cities, higher asthma rates, more vulnerable to like climate change. And I think this really made the climate movement resonate more with me. And I think in like climate education, I think it's very like crucial to like teach it as like a local issue rather than like, you know, something that's like global, just because I feel like it can make people a lot more like proactive with that kind of stuff and just see it as something that's like affecting their health. And just going on that, just a question to Wawa, what inspired you to do the work that you do today? What inspired you to like, you know, start the Black Girl Environmentalists and stuff like that and study the environment in like college?
Yeah, that's a great question. First, I just wanted to say this before I forget, but CT Deep is currently, I got this email the other day, but CT Deep is accepting applicants for their Environmental Justice Advisory Council. So that's like the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, I'm sure y'all know. And I think it'd be great if some of the folks here applied. It'd be a really great opportunity. I should have said this before, but I'm lifelong Connecticut resident. So this is like one of the first years I'm not like physically here all the time. But anyways, I will put the link there just because, again, environmental justice also has everything to do with like having equitable representation across ages, vocations, and like amount of time that we've been in the movement. So to answer your question, that's a pretty long-winded question. I'd say my journey with environmentalism and climate advocacy and the work that I do began officially when I was 16, but that interest definitely predated that. So growing up, I remember, you know, hearing about the polar bears and the melting ice caps. My art teacher showed us An Inconvenient Truth in the first grade. I was 5, and I remember going home and crying, and I, you know, moved on to the next thing. And that was very much my experience with environmentalism growing up. Every time I'd hear something, I'd be concerned, but there were other pressing issues that definitely felt a little bit more proximate to me. I think just a moment ago, you were talking about how environmental issues really felt very much out there. And there were other issues that definitely felt much more in my face. So there was kind of this amnesia that would happen. So when I was 16, I kind of stumbled into an environmental science class that I did not want to be in. My whole life, I thought I was going to be a doctor, you know, the immigrant dream put upon me by my parents. And I took a chemistry class, didn't go well. And I realized that I was not going to be able to do this in college. So I took environmental science because it was the only other science class that fit in my schedule. And my teacher, Mrs. Rose, actually decided to include environmental justice within the curriculum. It didn't exist. And I remember watching a TED Talk by Peggy Shepard, one of the executive directors from We Act in New York City. And I remember her talking about her community organizing in New York City and the work that she had done alongside incredible environmental justice advocates, and the way that she was breaking down environmental racism, environmental justice, and really essentially detailing how environmental justice, environmental concerns have everything to do with us, introducing me to the term environment from an environmental justice perspective of not just being the places that are out there, but very much being the places we eat, sleep, pray, spend our leisure time and things of that sort. And I had this aha moment of, whoa, all these other issues that I care so much about have everything to do with the environment. And I also felt as though it was extremely problematic that I was 16, 17 at the time, and this is the first time that I really felt like environmentalism and the issues that people that I before had pushed aside as having nothing to do with me actually had everything to do with me. And that the whole like futures, like Black futures and African futures have everything to do with like just climate solutions. So I kind of took this vow, I literally took this vow at home. I was like, I'm dedicating my life to environmental justice. That's it. You found your calling. There you go. And it kind of just took off from there. So I ended up going to the University of Connecticut, not so far from New Haven. I mean, kind of far, but y'all know. And I decided to study environmental studies. And essentially my experiences there also, I was really involved in environmental organizing and leadership in the Hartford area. I used to work for the city of Hartford in the Environmental Justice Office when it literally first came about. I was like their first intern. It was a very interesting experience, but I had this very interesting coming into my I guess my expertise as an EJ thought leader of being a student, seeing the gaps in environmental scholarship in regards to the fact that, you know, throughout that time, I had never learned anything about Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge. I never learned we had never had the opportunity to read any scholarship from Black and Indigenous scholars. It seemed as though expertise from my community wasn't necessarily being validated. I was the only Black student and student of color in my graduating class. And before me, there had been one other. I was living this paradox, right? Because I would take the bus to Hartford literally 4 times a week. And everyone that was doing environmental justice work, everyone doing environmental leadership work, there were other folks of color, right? And there were other people, and if they weren't of color, we were talking about how important equity and justice was in environmental work. So there's this weird paradox of, I was like, okay, we're being mobilized as next leaders in the state of Connecticut, environmental leaders, but there is a disconnect between what's actually going on the ground. So that kind of led me to realizing that there was perhaps some soul searching that needed to happen in the environmental space. And I quickly learned as I began to do more environmental work outside of the state and at a national level, I did internship at the Sierra Club, Latino Outdoors, was a part of this program called the Doris Duke Conservation Scholars Program, which essentially, I see someone nodding. Which essentially is an early career program for BIPOC students that are interested in conservation and environmentalism, for us to formulate a community really early on and get a lot of experience in the environmental space. And the conversations I was having with them just kind of let me know that my experiences and reflections and confusion wasn't mine alone, and was something that I likely would have experienced at another university. So I decided to study this further in grad school, and then got the scholarship that I'm on right now, and decided to launch Black Girl Environmentalist as I began to, I guess, work on making sure that environmental justice education and literacy was more available online. I think that when it comes to our generation, Gen Z, millennials, we are found, we spend a lot of our time right on social media. And I think it's important to mobilize the next generation by making these narratives as accessible as possible, as to get that content out there. So I started writing for different publications like Vice, Glamour, Vogue, and putting out my thoughts on being a Black environmental scholar, things that we need to do as a movement, the soul searching that I was talking about, making sure that our narrative is one that people see themselves in. And the responses I was getting from Black Girl Environmentalists from all over just led to Black Girl Environmentalists. And we've been going on for about 1.5 years. And yeah, that's kind of my long-winded story to BGE. Yeah.
Wow, that was really amazing. And just, wow, I can't imagine doing all that work, honestly. It's just, I don't know, I'm so Star Trek, I'm sorry. But for our last question, we wanted to address the question in the chat, which was, I believe, let me see. How have you seen, this question can go out to both of you, so whoever wants to answer. How have you seen certain communities in New Haven specifically being impacted by environmental racism? So if any of you wants to answer, or if you don't know about New Haven or just want to talk about something else, that also could work. But yeah.
Okay, so I can say that like the work that I've been doing has focused mostly on EJ and how that's manifested in Florida, more so Tampa Bay region of Florida, and also like right now my doctoral work is DMV focused, so DC, Maryland, and Virginia, because that's where I'm from. So getting started there for a regional analysis that will include the Mid-Atlantic, but my initial like case study area is the DMV. And yeah, and I think it's just important to be honest about like what you do and don't know. And I don't know, but I think that you all in your organization, like that is the work that you all focus on. So you should be able to answer the question and pivot it to what is the work that you all have been doing. But I know, Wawa, you're from Connecticut, so you might have a better answer to this question than I do.
Yeah, so I should also preface and say I'm not from New Haven. I grew up in the Northeast corner, so I actually grew up in rural Connecticut, uh, right on the border of Massachusetts. So I'm on the opposite end of New Haven. So I don't feel as though I could give a very good analysis of EJ in New Haven, perhaps maybe from a Connecticut perspective. I'll just say, broadly put, I think that the state of Connecticut has a lot of work to do in regards to EJ. I don't think that environmental justice has been taken seriously for a very long time. I will say that there are a lot of organizations like CHESPA, CT, Save the Sound that are working more on Connecticut roundtables. I'm going to miss so many people. There are many individuals and organizations in the state of Connecticut, like y'all, that are doing really great work. But from a policy perspective in the legislature, it has not been taken seriously at all. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done. I think that there is a lot of power, and especially from a state level. And like I saw a pillar in your organization of really pushing for a CT Green New Deal and really making sure to communicate with elected officials. I think that one of the benefits of being in a smaller state is the fact that you can go to Hartford and like have meetings with folks that are voting on these things all the time. You can talk about why certain legislation needs to be brought up. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity to be had even in running for office and doing it yourself if you want. And yeah, that's my perspective on Connecticut. I will say I have been a bit disconnected because I haven't been living in CT full time for the past 2 years, but I'm really looking forward to coming back next year. So that's something I'm really looking forward to. Yeah.
Thank you all so much for your responses. And I guess since we are part of the climate movement, I could take a stab at the question. I'm not really like well versed in this, but I know that Yale has done a lot, especially with redlining and stuff. And you could just see like the segregation, especially when you go downtown, you see all the nice coffee shops and the green space, and then like you just go out of downtown and there's the ghetto. I feel like Yale and these private institutions have contributed a lot to that. And I feel like New Haven is kind of a food desert in those like low income minority neighborhoods, especially when like, Stop and Shop is kind of like a mile or two away, or even when you go there, those foods are packaged, they're full of they're wrapped in plastic. Whereas if you went to a local supermarket in a more white affluent neighborhood, the fish would be fresh, the meat would be fresh, it'll be like literally in the freezer and whatnot. And so I feel like in New Haven, I don't know, I just feel like there is just frankly the food deserts and just the lack of funding the city has, which means that we can't like put funding towards education. We can't do a lot of stuff, especially like the school food, for example. I know like a lot of kids at my school, we don't eat the lunch because it's very I don't know, they serve us poison, So we just go the whole day without eating, or some kids would bring snacks like chips and whatnot, and there are many corner stores. So that obviously fuels unhealthy eating habits and reliance on junk food. And so I feel like that would be at least what I'm imagining, how I would see environmental issues in New Haven. And also the fact that we do have one of the highest asthma rates in Connecticut, especially for Black kids and minority kids. That is also a problem. And yeah, I don't know if that was an educated answer, but but yeah, it is 6 o'clock. Oh my God. thank you, everyone, for joining us. And before we close out, we would just like to say, obviously, thank you so much. And if you want to help with NHCM or you are interested, please send us an email. We're always accepting volunteers. Please email us at unevenclimate@gmail.com. Check us out on our YouTube channel, our website. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. You know I'm putting in all the plugs. And lastly, thank you. Thank you to everyone. Thank you to Wawa and Faith. We were very nervous for this webinar, and y'all just brought it. Like, y'all are carrying us. So thank you for just making this experience so phenomenal. And we loved your answers. I mean, I was starstruck, honestly. Y'all were so eloquent with your answers, and I hope I can do something like that in the future and be in the position you guys are in your advocacy work, because it's just very phenomenal to see Black women just succeeding. And I don't know, y'all give me faith, but yeah. But yeah, thank you everyone, and I hope y'all have a great day. Stay safe, stay warm, stay healthy, and yeah.
Bye everyone.
Bye everyone.
Bye everyone. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much.
No, thank you. Like, y'all were carrying us.
Definitely, like, we really appreciate you two coming.
Yeah.
They're gone.
Okay, great. So, okay, so that means I can stop recording. How do I do that? Oh, I have to actually open Zoom.
Okay,
Yeah.
thoughts?